Mississippi is renowned for its rich literary culture, attracting readers, writers, and book lovers from far and wide each year to the annual Mississippi Book Festival. Right On Mississippi presents Ebony Lumumba with Crystal Wilkinson, author of Praise Song for the Kitchen Ghost, a culinary journey that examines the Black Appalachians through Southern cuisine, storytelling, and recipes.
I could not be more thrilled to be here today because I get to sit across the table and talk to none other than the Crystal Wilkinson, Kentucky's Poet Laureate from 2021 to 2023, author of Perfect Black, Birds of Opulence, Water Street, Blackberries, and the highly anticipated Praise Song for the Kitchen Ghost, stories and recipes from 5 generations of Black country cooks. We're here to talk about that. I want to dive right into this book, since this is a genre I don't think I've seen. Mm-hmm. It's everything. It's narrative, it's poetry, the recipes, there's memoir. What led you to doing this project in this way?
Well, I have always written in a lot of different genres, but I think it was really the Birds of Opulence when I wrote that. Yeah. We'll call it a novel. When I wrote that novel was one of the first times as a writer I said, I'm not going to be this bifurcated writer, that the poet self and the fiction writer self and the essayist and the nonfiction self don't live in different houses.
Mm-hmm. They're all Crystal.
Yeah. That they're all here and I'm going to utilize them all simultaneously. So when I wrote this, I had that in mind as I began. And in some ways it was organic, and in some ways it was intentional. That one of the things that was important for me is to utilize the tools that I have available as a fiction writer to allow my ancestors to tell their own stories.
It is a journey of sorts, right? As you flip the page, we can see a bit of a journey, but I wonder about your own journey in putting this together, what discoveries you made about yourself and your family and the connection to food and stories. Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I think that food is the great unifier in some ways. And one of the things that surprised me when I was writing is that I wanted to, of course, use food as the lens for my family story, and I wanted it to then in turn make people think about their own stories.
It does that.
And I wanted my ancestors to be stand-in for all of our ancestors. But I was also surprised that there was this deep sort of undercurrent of grief as I was writing, that I couldn't write about my grandmother and the food that she cooked without missing her. And without experiencing that grief. And I was surprised to find that even like Grandma Aggie, who's 3 generations away, that I found that I missed her too, even though I'd never met her.
That's a Morrison kind of rememory moment, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and being able to imagine, it's part historical research, part sort of archival. Like I went and found all of these photographs. I found deeds and documents that are all sort of poured in here. Oral tradition, stories from my family, and sort of wove. I see it as a braided, there's the braided essay or the lyric essay, but I see this as a braided book. And then I used all of those tools that were available to me to write it.
There were moments as I was reading, one that particularly sticks out to me is when you talk about the pokeweed berries and leaves. And it had never occurred to me that people ate them because we were always told to stay away from them. But then there's this very chilling quote from the text that says, "My people ate poison plants to survive." And so talk a little bit about that grief a bit more and what it motivated.
Yeah, I mean, it was the grief, of course, having experienced my grandmother's life and then also experienced her death and mourned for her. But like what you were talking about, like also a longing and a mourning for the land, because that land is not in my family anymore. So there was that land loss that was a certain type of grief that I experienced. There was also, I don't know if you would call it not necessarily nostalgia, but there was this recognition that there were things that we would never be able to that I would never be able to touch again or to recover, and how much things had changed. Because of course I'm grateful to be in the generation of plenty and not in the generation of survival and not and scarcity.
Right on. Yeah.
We forage for fun. It's one of the things.
This whole farm to table movement.
Yeah, it's a big thing now. Like to go out into the woods and find mushrooms or to find fiddleheads or to find greens. But to think about, I talked to my aunt who's in her 80s, and she said, and I quote her in the book, I said, well, did you like those things that you found? And she said, my mother made a good meal out of them, but the bottom line was eat it or die. And when she said that, just, gratitude, how grateful I am and how grateful I am for the privilege that I have now, and the sadness and wondering about her life and sort of the sadness in her own voice, remembering that. Like she remembered things that were happy. Like she remembered her going out with her brothers and sisters and gathering all that food. But when she said that, she meant it. Eat it or die.
Because that absolutely was the case. Eat it or die. And, what it caused me to do was think about the generations upon generations that we don't have access to through food stories or any other stories. So we are imagining and filling these spaces and gaps, and the gratitude that they did somehow sustain and survive so that we could exist. But what that survival looked like, my God, it's a sobering concept.
Right. Yeah, it is extremely sobering, and even the reclamation of these foods and the way that I'm presenting them, I think that what happens is our generation's comfort food. Like I love, we love things like chicken. I love chicken and dumplings.
Love it. Love a good cobbler.
Love a good cobbler. But, like chicken and dumplings is a comfort food, but it was a survival food.
Yeah.
In my grandmother's time.
Absolutely.
It was, what can we make?
Let me drop this flour down here. Yeah. Gravy.
How can I feed all these people? Like I got a little bit of meat. Got a little bit of broth. I'm going to put a little bit of starch in here.
Right.
But also every culture has,
so survival foods.
You got like fufu or cassava.
Yeah. And now people crave it.
Yeah. It becomes the next generation's comfort food. So it made me think about both the past and the future. Like what will be the next generation's comfort foods?
You talked about your grandmother, and I've heard you talk about your grandmother before. She's such an integral part of your development and your life. But here, I felt like I really saw you talk about your grandmother and that bond. And you say that she equated food with love, and she cooked with a fury and a quiet joy.
Mm-hmm. Before I found Grandma Aggie, who was, 3 generations prior to me, I thought, well, I can write easy about my grandmother because she raised me. I know all about her. But then when I was writing about her and remembering and remembering, things just kept coming up and discoveries that I made and this sort of reverence we have for our ancestors and our grandparents, and particularly our mothers and grandmothers, but to also think of them as girls and women. It's somewhere in the writing of this, it hit me when I was writing the holidays, and there was an interview in a newspaper that my grandmother did, and she was talking about around the holidays was when she got her mother's stack cake is what she remembered, and she remembered a corn shuck doll that my great-grandmother had made for her. And it didn't dawn on me until I was writing this many, many years later that she never once mentioned that she got married
Yeah.
By the time she died, she had cooked 60 holiday meals. She had cooked for her family for 60 years and got married at 14. And so, of course, she's on a pedestal because she's my grandmother, but I began to see her as a woman and as a girl, and to sort of step into her shoes a little bit and experience things, to think about experiencing things as she might have experienced them. And so it was a way to sort of hold her and her life up to the light and sort of turn it around and look at it. And I suddenly saw things that I never saw as a child, and things that weren't just from my memory, but being able to just kind of look at things that I never thought about before.
There's something you were claiming for us here from this tendency to push away from domesticity in this, in the culinary realm. There's something quite powerful that I don't know that I would have been able to grasp in the same way had it not been demonstrated through this food story. So there's something very womanist and bold and audacious about these recipes being linked to what we know.
Yeah. I mean, and of course, like I said, my grandmother was a domestic worker. The generations before her were enslaved.
Right.
And a lot of that enslavement and that work involved not just cooking for your family, but making sure these other people were fed. First, the enslavers, and then making sure the men were fed, making sure your children were fed, and people think of cooking and as a sacrifice, or the kitchen as a vessel of sacrifice and enslavement. That even modern day, like I'm slaving in this kitchen to make sure that people have these meals. But the kitchen is also the center of the universe.
It's sacred.
Yeah, for many of us, it's not just the food, although the food, let me tell you, is a big part.
We like that.
It's a big part, yeah. And we feel loved when our favorite foods are put forth. But for me, and probably for you too, the kitchen was also like where you learn the secrets. As I remember as a little girl just sitting around like listening, and then they, if they noticed you
couldn't say nothing.
Yeah, if they noticed you though, they'd be like, "Girl, go
get
on,
out of here,
get out of here." But by then, I'd already learned.
I know all the stuff, all the tea.
Yeah, I already knew something. It's where we got our hair done.
It's where we got that hair pressed.
Yeah.
Because where else could you warm a hot comb?
Yeah, in the kitchen.
In the kitchen,
and it was sort of and you learned knowledge. I think I learned how to be a woman in the kitchen.
How to be a woman.
Make sure you do this, and not just about the food, but like you want to make sure that you're this kind of woman, and make sure that you do this and you do that. And so it's for many Black families and for many Southern families, in my case, Appalachian families, it's the center of the universe. It's where everything gets, and that's the only place, the woman of my grandmother's time, the kitchen was the only place she had full control, even over my grandfather.
That's it.
Nowhere else could she tell him what to do.
Or hide things.
When she was getting stuff done, she would say, Silas, go out there. I need a bucket of water. I need go down to the smokehouse. I need a ham. Get me 3 jars of blackberries, and I need all this done by 4 o'clock.
And he was going to do it.
And he was running around. But, I can't imagine where else, like on his farm while he's, growing tobacco or anything like that. I can't imagine her saying, Silas, I need you to do this.
And him doing it.
Yeah, and him doing it. But anything that had to do with that kitchen, and it wasn't just.
It's her domain.
Yeah. And it wasn't just that he wanted to eat. It was like, okay, this is her, like you said, her domain.
I love the moment where you talk about hanging your grandmother's apron after she passes to conjure her back into the kitchen, to wake up the kitchen ghost. Talk about that moment. What happened, right? Because you tell us that you do that, but walk through kind of what that felt like for you.
Well, it happened right after my grandmother passed. And so she had passed, and I knew how to cook. I was always her helper, one of her helpers anyway, and helped her in the kitchen. So it wasn't that I didn't know how to cook, but after she died, she had 7 children. She had 25 plus grandchildren, and we would all cram in that little house for every holiday meal. And all of the significant others, the spouses, the children. And so when she died, it's like, how do we family?
How do we family?
A verb.
The verb. I was about to say as an action.
Yeah. How do we family?
Without her.
And so everyone decided to just stay home and cook where they were, do whatever. That was the first time we started our own traditions in our own little small households versus coming together as a large group. And so I said, okay, well, I'm going to cook. And I started cooking, and I just could not do it. I was breaking down crying. I know how to cook. I was cooking for my mother and for my 3 children. I didn't know how to cook for 5 people. I knew how to cook for 25 people.
Yeah, right.
But I didn't know how to cook for 5 people.
Isn't that it?
And I was crying. I was breaking down, and I went back and got her dress. It was her dress, not her apron.
That's right.
And I brought her dress into the kitchen. I hung it up on the back door, and with the hanging of the dress and imagining her in the kitchen was the first time that I came up with that term, the kitchen ghost. And suddenly I felt like she was there with me, and that she was there saying, okay, girl, come on, you can do this. Don't put too much sage in that. Like, make sure you don't salt that too much. Add this next. And so I was able to finish it. And that's when the term came. And then I found that kitchen ghost came in other ways. That even when I'm standing at the kitchen window and the way that the morning light falls into the kitchen and makes a pool of light on the floor, the way that it did in my childhood kitchen, that time of morning was a certain invitation for the kitchen ghost to come. The way the steam comes up when you're boiling potatoes for mashed potatoes was a way for the kitchen ghost to sort of appear in the steam. The kneading of dough, looking down when I'm kneading dough and saying, oh, it looks like my grandmother's hands, or in that muscle memory of doing something. And you suddenly, just like when you walk by a mirror and you go, oh, hello, mama.
Yeah, exactly. Like, oh, I am my mama's child.
Yeah, there she is. I think that happens in the movements that you make with cooking too, the beating of things,
that's right,
the stirring of pots. Because it was in their muscle memory, and I think it transfers.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
Because I have some favorite recipes tagged in here.
Okay.
And some of them, what I found lovely about this, Crystal, was some of them I had never and still haven't tasted. I don't know them. They're not a part of my family's culinary lore. But the stories within them make the food thing that I haven't even tasted, but I'm imagining my favorite. And then there are others, like the greens and the dumplings, the biscuits with the blackberry soup, that all feel very familiar to me. And so I can taste my mama's iteration of that in reading your work. And my grandmother's food that I haven't tasted. I haven't eaten my grandmother's food in almost 30 years. There's a certain point where she stopped cooking. And so, but I could taste it in my mind's eye, right, as you put together this piece. And so talk to us about your favorites. Do you have favorites? Can you choose? Is it like children where you shouldn't choose?
Well, I think I have 2 favorites. They're all my favorites, really. But the food that appears in the book is there because of the stories.
Right.
There was lots of food that I left out. Everything's not in there. But I think the chicken and dumpling recipe, because of the universality of it,
that's right.
is one of my favorites. It's people think it's hard, but it's easy to make, and it's easy to feed a lot of people. And because blackberries is connected to both my mother and my grandmother and my great grandmother as well. I think any of the blackberry recipes are ones that I'm fond of. The cobbler, the quick cobbler, and the slow cobbler, and the blackberry soup.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I like the blackberry ones too.
And then moving forward, like the wild berry lemonade that also uses blackberries. So the blackberry, in the way that it was such an intricate part of my family's summer, and it lasted all year, is one of the reasons why the blackberry is so important, because we would go and pick blackberries, and you had to, in order to pick blackberries in the wild like that, you had to, they'd put coal oil around your wrists to keep the bugs off. They'd wrap up. It'd be, dead of summer, and you'd have to have all these long sleeves, long pants on to go out. And then, the briars on the bushes, you had to fight them to get the berries. You had to watch out for snakes. It was very complicated. Chiggers, you had to watch out for chiggers to make sure you didn't get bit. And so, the plunk, the sound of the berries hitting the bucket, the bottom of the bucket or the bottom of the pan, the aluminum pan, making that ping, ping, ping.
That bounty that you're just building.
And eating them fresh. We were eating all kinds of ants. Who knows what we were eating?
All kind of dirt.
It was so good. And then her cleaning them when we got home, and her freezing some and canning some. And so you'd have this whole experience, and maybe having a cobbler that night. But what was great is that come the holidays, and in December, that's when she would say to my grandfather, "Now you go down there at cellar and get me a jar of them blackberries." And then for the holidays, when the jam cake would come into play, and she would use a mason jar of those blackberries, those same blackberries that we, to cook and make jam, to make the jam cake. So it was cyclical. And so that's one of my favorite recipes in there too. The recipes that appear, what I'm saying is the recipes are an amalgam of my grandmother's recipes.
Yeah.
Because, one, she didn't write a lot of her recipes down. I dictated them. Occasionally she would. But I've always made this big deal out of, you cannot, people say, well, I can't make it like my mother. And I was like, no, and you won't.
You won't.
One, because the memory is more powerful than anything you can do in this physical world. You remember how a particular food tasted
and what you were feeling.
Yes.
When you were tasting that thing.
Yeah, but you can't completely replicate that. And then two, the ingredients have changed.
That's the part. The ingredients have changed. The access has changed.
Yeah. It's one thing to put in, vegetable shortening. When your ancestors
lard
had a pig there, they had the lard that came from their pig, or came from Mr. So-and-so's pig right down the road. So you knew the whole chain of where your food came from. And it was all local or at least regional. And we don't have that privilege anymore.
We know we can't do it like them. But what will you have us to do with Praise Song for the Kitchen Ghost?
I think the idea is that you lean into your own kitchen ghost. Like I said, my family is a stand-in, and Grandma Aggie's a stand-in for all of the tens of thousands of Black women who never had a voice. But I think in the book, my kitchen ghosts are a stand-in for your own kitchen ghosts, and leaning in them and not being afraid. So many people are afraid of trying this old recipe because they're like, "Oh, I can't
do it.
Yeah, I can't cook it like Mama." Ask her. Even if she's not here, lean into it. Ask her to come forth and help you with it.
I love that. And the concept of praise songs, it's keeping alive these heroines.
Yes.
That is so gripping.
Yes, absolutely. Lifting them up. Even generations and generations later.
Telling their story.
Yes.
Singing their story.
Yes.
And cooking them too. Crystal,
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for this book. And it's so courageous and practical too. So you can find your place in it as a reader. as I have. And I hung out at this hot milk cake for a while. The story is remarkable, but I cannot wait to actually make the cake.
It's good.
I can taste it in my mind. Thank you, Crystal.
Thank you. Thank you so much.